children, I am very proud of myself.
Finish your degree at snu.edu.
Hello? Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you. This is James.
Hey, James, how are you? How's it going?
Okay.
Listen, we got to get together on the Forex thing. I'm going to send you slides, see if you can do something.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether or not I can attend yet, but I hope to. But I'm happy to talk to you.
Okay.
Yeah. There is one thing I would really highly suggest. Is that you change the title from Forex to FX, because Forex means strictly the retail end. That they've
okay.
adopted it as a marketing thing. If FX or FIC is what we call it in the professional market. FIC stands for fixed income currencies and commodities.
Okay. Well, the thing is that it's going to be mostly about money exchange, and I want to just show them MetaTrader 4, which is, I guess, Oanda, and show them like a simple trade. You know, how we calculate the lot, how we calculate the the PIP and all that stuff.
Yeah. That's right. But it's not the big thing to emphasize is that it's not in the professional market anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Is it's not about sort of buying low and selling high, or the opposite. It's a hedge market. It's as I mentioned before, it's hedge risk.
Correct. But that's what we're going to talk about, and I'm going to have my buddy from IM Academy have like a 10-minute presentation at the end.
Mm-hmm.
So you'll just talk about how what they do, obviously, and if everybody interested at the end. I mean, it's up to them, obviously. It's not like, it's a history, first of all. It's not a,
Well, in the history, I can tell you, I mean, the modern foreign exchange market does date from the Nixon the Nixon 75, and that's when the world changed. We had started to have floating exchange rates.
Correct. So mostly the first hour is going to be mostly ancient, money trading, where the paper money came from, China, the Daric, which is the Phoenician money exchange, and then we're going to get into modern, and then I'll have Aaron present. He used to set up trading systems for different platforms, so he can really talk about a little bit of fintech, all that beautiful stuff side of it, because I'm not really familiar with fintech stuff that much, but obviously those Forex effect, Forex choice, and and Oanda all came from somewhere, right? I mean, there was no other. Yeah.
I mean, they're all individual market makers. I mean, you're
Correct.
trading with the market maker, one market maker.
Correct.
In those sense, and then margin in the professional market, we don't margin.
Right.
And then so it should be fun, and I hope I can get there. I'll be there. I should know tomorrow. I look forward to it. The the death of Bretton Woods and the Nixon shock is the beginning of the modern era. And then very shortly after that, there was the next event, not a foreign exchange event. It was Black Scholes was developed and published, and then suddenly people wanted to make very complicated hedges, etc., and that uses a lot of credit.
Correct.
We can talk about that a bit later. But you're in finance, aren't you?
I am in finance, yeah. Fixed income, yeah. Not equities or Forex. I'm in fixed income. Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, mortgage-backed securities, stuff like that. I want to welcome some people. James is here. Andre, how are you? How's former, Europe? How's Europe doing? Are they happy that with our current selection of president?
Well, it's interesting actually to see what will happen. Me personally, I don't see any, because I follow politics. There's no difference between presidents and government.
I see.
Really, no matter which president changes, there's no difference between foreign policy and geostrategic interests of certain country. This is universal for any country. So when the current Trump versus Biden was just for small details and what kind of party color will be, there would be no difference for the U.S. foreign policy at all.
There would be a big difference, my friend. I beg to differ. One doesn't like China, one likes China. One doesn't like Ukraine, one likes Ukraine. You know, like, and Ukrainian people suffer. Obviously, we want, you know.
Yeah, but that's, I think, more in name than in reality. For example, the Afghanistan war. How many administration is so far? And for example, if Trump really didn't want troops in Afghanistan, he could, because this is not Congress-approved war. It's just an executive order. So the U.S. presidents, if they want, they could withdraw troops immediately on the first day when he became president.
No, well, you can't. You have to go through Congress and Parliament. You can't just do it on your own volition. Obviously, you also have the coalition forces. You can't just, you know, withdraw forces and, you know, tell coalition forces, "Oh, thank you for helping us, but have a nice day."
Am I right though that only the most recent declaration of war, according to the Constitution, was World War II? I thought that the subsequent wars were all undeclared.
Correct. Correct. As a president vested. Yeah, but he's a, you know, chief commander in chief, so it's
a couple of times. Congress has voted an authorization of hostilities, but legally that isn't the same.
I don't know. Again, it will be interesting to follow, but people change, but countries' interests don't change. So it's mostly about, are you having abortion rights or not when president change. But foreign interest, I haven't seen change of administration with change of foreign interests. Maybe the Bolsheviks, when they killed the Tsar, then the Soviet changed strategy, but only a little bit. Because after that, Soviets again were empire, and they attacked Finland and stuff like that. So even that change of administration, let's call it, didn't follow with change in foreign policy.
Yeah, I would say with the Soviets, it became even more apparent that they want to be an empire because they wanted to take over the proletariat of all, you know, nations unite. But it was a personal, you know, policy, I guess, of Stalin.
Ever see the movie Alice?
Yeah, I find that very interesting.
Hi, I just want to welcome some. So you have Rachel is here. Jonathan is going to come in later. We got some new people. Hampton Maxwell. As I get Stephanie. Sergio is here. Sergio, Richard is here.
Hey,
Sergio, so we'll give it 5-10 minutes. And
yeah.
Do you see my slides, or you're good with
Yes,
slides?
I can see it. I can see it. Yeah, totally.
Excellent. So just to give a little synopsis today, again, you know, not to use a particular labels, but we're talking about Teutonic Order today. You know, and particularly Sergio invited his friend Jonathan. Sergio is going to talk about, you know, some other orders, now they call it Maltinian order, but it used to be hospitaliers and all that stuff, and Dutch order, and Denmark order and all the other stuff that he's going to talk about. But Teutonic Knights particularly, I connect them to German tribes, not Prussian tribes, because Prussians were more connected with Lithuanians at the time. But I connect them with German tribes. I really don't want to cause any kind of political issues here, but I remember Rosenberg during the Nazi time had particularly used Teutonic Knights to invade the East and saying, in the whole aspect of, lending and taking the lands from the eastern parts was based on how Teutonic Knights was basically trying to convert to Christianity, or Catholicism, the parts of the Lithuania, which were barbarians, and Russia, and we know how that ended. At the beginning, it was nice and dandy, but then it ended pretty badly. But it is what it is. And then, so today we're going to talk about that. And so we'll give it 5 more minutes. Next week we have 3 presentations. So just wanted to kind of reiterate. On Wednesday, Richard and Aaron are going to do a Karabakh conflict, which is actually a current conflict, somewhat, stems back to the old times, but it's a current conflict that's ongoing right now. And I think this week the Azerbaijani forces took one of the cities from Artsakh, they call it. It's a Karabakh area of Armenia. And so that I think is going to boil out in a pretty nasty conflict. So we're going to talk about it Wednesday. Thursday, we have history of money or history of FX, as James has pointed out. And depending if James is in, he's going to help me. And then maybe a little bit Aaron is going to help me with that presentation. On Saturday, we have Delian League. So we go from history of money to ancient Greece to current Karabakh. And today we're talking about medieval Europe. So I'm sure we're not short of any subjects, guys. So subject matter. And John is here. Joe is here. How are you, John? You've been missing action a couple of days, a couple of presentations. Yeah.
I'm back.
Yes, I'm glad. You always have very good inputs. Bruno is here. How's France? We have another European there also from former Yugoslavia. Andre, you're from Montenegro, right? Montenegro?
No, Macedonia.
Macedonia, sorry, you're from Macedonia, yes. Or as we call it, North Macedonia, right? Not to offend anybody. As a joke, obviously.
Now, is it pronounced Macedonia or Macedonia?
Macedonia.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah,
With
Macedonia.
K. But K doesn't exist in English. So.
Wait.
Yeah.
Are you saying in English or in the Macedonian language?
So in my language, I would say Macedonia.
And in English, it's Macedonia.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's the same way that we say Cyprus and they say Cyprus.
Oh, I didn't know
Yeah,
that.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it's different for us. Here you can use K for C and K, and in our language K is K. I mean,
Yeah.
we have I don't know if you guys use Latin alphabet. We use Cyrillics in former Soviet Union.
Giants with one eye in the middle of their head are the Cyclopes.
Cyclop.
Cyclopes.
Yeah.
Well, we say cyclop. We say cyclop. We use the word "se." You right, Andre?
Yes.
Cyclop.
But the country that has the most different name is Montenegro, actually, because Montenegro is Crna.
But
So it's
Crna Gora means the same as Montenegro. Crna Gora, it means Black Mountain. Montenegro means Black Mountain.
Yes, but the pronunciation is just completely from Crna Gora to Montenegro is not a single letter is the same. I find that interesting.
Montenegro sounds very Latin.
Yeah, it was the name of the Italians gave the area.
Who?
The Italians.
Oh, makes sense. Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, so we have, Sergio, how many minutes you want to give? Another 2-3 minutes? Since-
Yeah.
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 How long is going to be your presentation versus Jonathan is going to take
Not
over?
not long at all. Not long at all.
So we'll give it another 5 minutes. So people
Okay.
are gathering. It's already 19 minutes, 19 people. So
Okay.
I want to welcome
Yeah,
some
sounds
people.
good.
Jane is here. Paul is here. Bruno, as I mentioned. Joe. Mr. Greg is here. All right. I'm getting good turnout today. Suppose it'll be 30 people, but let's, as Greg says, people sign up and they don't show up. So,
Yeah, well, listen, the weather's so nice, and people like, they're like, oh, I don't know,
I know. I worked out this morning in the LIC. By the way, Sergio, you're welcome.
Yeah, you did a workout in Long
I did a workout today. Yeah, we have good turnout.
What time? What time?
8:45.
Okay.
Next week, 8:45 at the same place, LIC Landing.
Nice. Okay, but you do it based on the weather, right? It's not like it's not scheduled regularly. It's based on the forecast.
Well, if weather permits, every Sunday, yeah.
Yeah, because it's normally not this warm.
Okay, Jonathan said he's back. So you want me to stop sharing and let Jonathan share?
It doesn't matter as long as I have the access to those first 2 slides.
Yes, I think Sergio is our man.
Hey, Jonathan, how are you, buddy?
Great, brother.
Jonathan, I'm gonna stop sharing and you're gonna present because you're gonna slide right through. So hold on, let me just now you have a right to share. Go ahead.
Wonderful. Let me get my presentation ready to go.
First of all, hi, how are you, my friend? And then when you're gonna start the presentation, introduce yourself as well. So we have a lot of new people here as well. We'll do introductions later, but at least a presenter.
All right, so we're ready for me to go ahead and share here.
Yes, go ahead.
And then we will take a look and we'll go full screen.
Excellent.
Right there. Is
Yep,
that good for everybody?
Yes, I can see it.
Perfect.
Sure.
Sergio, whenever you're ready, we will hand it over to you.
Absolutely. Thank you. First, let me introduce Jonathan to the group. Jonathan is a reenactor buddy of mine. As you guys know, I like to participate in certain historical reenactment events, and he likes to portray the Teutonic Order from the 12th century. 13, sorry.
Yeah, 13. That's all
I
right.
like to portray the area of Al-Andalus around the 11th and 12th. So yeah, that's how we know each other. We love history. We like to reenact. We like to reconstruct history and so on and so forth. So yeah, please welcome him to the group. He's very knowledgeable in this particular area in history. And so today I'm going to just talk a little bit about the other orders at the time. I'm not going to get very deep into it. If I pass by certain things that you want to add to it, feel free to add to the conversation. But I'm just going to give you an overview before Jonathan then takes over and discusses about the Teutonic Knights and so forth. So we'll first start with the Hospitallers. Now, they were there in the Holy Land long before the even First Crusades. Okay, so they were basically a foundation that was focusing on helping the sick and the injured Christians that were there for pilgrimage, right? They were there to help people that were going to the Holy Land for this part of their spiritual journey. Okay, so they were like medics, if you want to call them that. Now, in Europe at this time, there really wasn't any established facility for medicine, right? For the most part, it was the monasteries that were attending to the sick and the injured people. And there was some knowledge of medicine in herbal forms. They did have some understanding of it from the ancients, but not a whole lot. Obviously, they did a whole lot of prayer and stuff like that. But in the Middle Eastern part of the world, such as Constantinople, Antioch, and obviously Jerusalem, well, they had access to a lot of those ancient texts from the Greeks and from the Romans. So their understanding of medicine was, let's say, better. I wouldn't say super advanced, but they had more advantages than in actual Europe. So they were, for the most part, a hospital, for the lack of a better term, hence the name Hospitaller Lights. So they were involved in that for quite a while. So since 1070 is when they were established, okay? And obviously the first Crusades was 1090, so almost 20 years before they launched the first People's Crusade. And up until the 12th century, they, because of the Knights Templar, who would then come along later, and I'll get into them in a little bit, they then become a military order. They now start getting backings from kings and other nobles that will now support them to make them a military force. Okay, so now they'll have horses, and they'll have armor, and they'll have equipment, and they'll pretty much have an established military force to be reckoned with. They'll also be given castles and lands and stuff like that. So they become relatively powerful at this point. This is, we're talking about 11th, 12th century. And they were known for, and so I'll get into the surcoats. So surcoats in general, it's believed, although not confirmed, they were established in the Holy Land. So people, knights and warriors, would go with their chainmail shirts and armor, and it was so hot that they might have put in a cloth over it to cool them, right? To keep them cool, sort of like a, you know, a way of not overheated. And eventually they would then put their mark on these coats, and then they would just, all of a sudden, this would become like the fashion. If you were part of a knight of a certain house, or you were fighting for a certain house, or you were part of a specific order, such as this, then they would wear their charge on these surcoats, so forth. And so the hospitals, they were wearing a dark mantle, or a dark surcoat with a white Maltese cross, with the white cross on the right there. And they were actually relatively successful. They were even in parts of Spain and Portugal. Some believe that they actually established the state of Portugal, which was part of Iberia all on its own at this point in time. And they will go on even to the better part of the 16th century, the hospital. So they were pretty much a long order when we think about crusading overall.
Sergio, can I add something?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, you just mentioned that this is called Maltese cross, and the reason is that they eventually established their primary residence on Malta.
Headquarters, yeah.
Yeah, that's where they stood up to the Turks in 16th century.
And their stop on the way there was the island of Rhodes,
right?
Which was their headquarters until they were driven out. And if you ever do travel to Rhodes now, the city of Rhodes, it's actually the Hospitallers are also called the Knights of St. John of Jerusalem.
Yes.
That's the ancient fortress that you now see rebuilt on the city of Rhodes was their headquarters, rebuilt famously or infamously by Mussolini. And he's got his name carved inside, much to everybody's embarrassment, but that's where it is. Then they got driven out of Rhodes and ended up in Malta.
And in Malta, the city now called La Valette. So that was the magister of
right. He was
order. Yeah.
right. He was their leader, Jean. And they were tremendously rich, tremendously influential, and there's lots of conspiracy theories about them.
Tons. We could spend all day discussing that. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, gentlemen.
No, Sergio, quick question to you.
Yeah.
Just a general question. How much of we obviously know that it was supposedly, a warrior monks, so to speak, right? But how much was it also driven, business-like type of, traders were driving them to increase the ports and the, areas to deal with their goods and stuff like that? Was it also a money-driven adventure, all this, so to speak, pilgrimages?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Excellent question, and I was going to get into that. Yeah, I think overall these orders were extremely lucrative, and they had a lot of power and a lot of influence, and that might have meant to some of their decline. At the same time, it also meant a lot of other kings. I mean, there's a reason why they were given huge donations and offered a lot of lands, because they were relatively powerful. They were strong knights. They were very successful in battle. And let's face it, in war times, you want to have an army that's relevant and that's fierce and so forth. So yes, there was a lot of riches, at least in my opinion, within these knights, whether they seem to be more humble or maybe have a religious Exterior, I think they were overall well off. There was certainly rewards.
And some of that changes over time. I think
Right.
something really important to note is there's kind of a trajectory that you see with each of the big three orders, the Hospitallers, the Templars, who really were around a lot less than the others, the Hospitallers and the Teutonic Order. But to what Sergio was saying, yes, there is that element, but it's a progression. It's not something that's all in at once. Things change over time.
Yeah, you may be getting into this as well. This is Ann Verum, but one of the things the Knights Templars developed in their financial system was what we call today letters of credit. And it was it was basically a proto-banking system, somewhat based on the Venetian model as well. But that handling of those letters of credit was a big business because of course there's, just like modern times, the transactional fees involved. And a Knights Templar letter of credit was so popular because they were honored. It was a system that was secure, and you could buy a letter of credit in Jerusalem and it would be cashed in Paris or Tours or wherever.
Now, I want to ask one question. What is the extent to which these originally Crusader orders were influenced by their close contact with the Muslim world? I mean, they actually lived next to Muslims for decades. So I think that despite the fact that they were at war with them, they actually inherited or received knowledge from them and expertise, and they were pragmatic people. They adopted what worked.
Yeah, the John here, the elites did mingle quite a bit. I mean, there was European aristocrats respecting Arab aristocrats and vice versa. So there was a Syrian prince in the 12th century, Usama ibn Munkir, who had a very revealing account of the Crusaders, and he had very good knowledge of their customs. A lot of what we know about them comes from an Arab Muslim. And I remember reading in Al-Hayat, an Arab newspaper, an account 900 years after Usama's death. He was accused of fraternizing with the enemy by this Arab colonist. This was in the 1990s. So attitudes die hard, but there was a lot more association than you would think between the two groups, at least at high levels.
Yeah, exactly. There was a lot of that going on. Thank you, John. Okay, so now let me quickly go wrap up the Knights Templar. So they were founded in the early 12th century, and their primary function right from the beginning was to protect. They created a line of protection for Christians that were visiting the Holy Land. Okay, that was their main focus, their order. And they were given a portion of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, and this is why they were then later called the Templar Knights. Originally, they were called the Poor Fellow Christian Knights, which they were a lot more humble, and they were not as huge an influence, and they certainly did not have the finances as they will later. Okay, it's believed that they were monks, take it with a little grain of salt, that they were really, they were supposed to be praying a few times a day. They did a lot of chants. They had certainly rituals, but they were also serious knights in battle. Each Templar had 2 horses on his own, and they had the latest armor of the time. In fact, the little seal on the bottom there, which is Sigillum Militum, which is the seal of the soldiers. You see 2 knights, on one horse, which is kind of like saying that they're humble. They're not really a big traditional form of knights. They're more low-key and so forth. But that is not necessarily the case, at least not later. They will later become a lot more rich because of the donations that they're given throughout Europe. One in particular, Alfonso I of Aragon, he leaves them a substantial amount of land after he passes away to the Templars. And the Templars, by the way, fought in a lot of the Andalusian battles, specifically the conquest of Majorca when they fought against the Almohades. And so yeah, all throughout Europe and the Holy Land, the Templars are pretty well renowned. They're very well respected. And unfortunately, later, as Anne pointed out, they established a huge system of money transferring, right? They were kind of like traveler's checks of its day. You could transfer your money in London and then get it in Jerusalem. So they had a lot of access to currency, and they also lended money. They actually lended money to Philip the Fourth of France and many other nobles later there, and not because of it. Again, that's another discussion. We can spend hours discussing that. Later in the around 1307, they're accused of all these crimes, heresy, religious disobedience, and so forth, and stuff like that, in which they disband the Templar Knights. Even the Pope doesn't support them for these allegations, and some of the grandmasters were actually burned at the stake. So it was a really, really dark time for the Templars. And it's believed that some of the Templars would then join incognito into the Hospitaller Knights or other orders. Now, there were other orders that come around later, like the Knights of Santiago in Spain and so forth. So the Knights Templars will eventually disappear, but really they just emerged into other orders for the most part. And their lands would be given to other orders like the Hospitallers. So that's, yeah, an overall look at these particular orders, the Hospitaller Knights and the Templars, just to give you an idea of how these organizations started and how powerful they become and how, you know, consistent they were in Europe. And it's like people really respected them, and they revered them, and they were interested in having them in their side, especially, for example, in Spain, when even the north, you know, Castile, Leon, Aragon, and Navarra, yeah, they're in the north, they're all Christian, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily on each other's, they're in cahoots with each other, right? They're constantly, these houses constantly fighting with each other. So obviously you have kings like Alfonso I that wants to have the Templars on his pocket because he knew that they were powerful. And, you know, if ever there's a breach between certain houses in the north, he's got a secret weapon. So that's probably one of the reasons, at least in my opinion, why these orders become very, very big and influential. So
Sergio, we have one question from James, if you don't mind, and then
sure.
Go ahead.
But one question: these people, Knights Templars, and all these orders, would they have spent their whole life in guarding the holy path to the Holy Land, etc., or did they come from other parts of Europe and when they were older go back?
Great question. So yeah, for the most part, they were equivalents to knights. So they weren't just noble people, just commoners. To be a Hospitaller, to be a Templar, you would have to be of some nobility, like if you were going to be a regular knight. And I would think, for the most part, yeah, they spent a good portion of their life fighting. This was like a brotherhood. This wasn't a 10-year or 20-year allegiance. This was a good portion of their life.
You have to imagine that they must have recruited, right? I mean, there must have been a constant influx of new members.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that's something I plan to talk a little bit
took
about.
Casualties, and they didn't replace from within. They weren't reproducing as a society.
I mean, yeah, absolutely, Paul. For them to be powerful, they had to have strength in numbers. You can't just have 30 or 40 of them. They had hundreds of them, and they were all devoted. And like I said, they were compensated. So it was an honor. It was definitely something they look forward to. It was not.
I believe that there are actually some modern decorations that can be traced to the Hospitallers in particular, that are actually still worn by royal heads of state where they exist, like perhaps England.
There is organizations, Masonic
they
ones.
do it under, Knights of St. John is usually
yeah,
the way they
exactly.
refer to it. And I think
or
some
Knights of Malta.
people, some founding members of the American the United States, I think, had some membership.
Right, yeah. The Templars and Hospitallers, and I believe in the Teutonic Knights, they still have organizations that kind of go and descend another direction from the original order, but yeah, they do have an existence chapter to today's world. So with further ado, I would like to now pass it to Mr. Jonathan Hodges, who will discuss about the Teutonic Order.
Thank you, Sergio, and thank you, gentlemen and ladies, for some good questions so far. Sergio has set the scene for us perfectly. There are the big three when we're talking about military orders. Of course, there were, there are several when we talk about military orders in general. Lots of smaller ones, but as far as big time conglomerates, international groups, there's really the big three, which would be the Hospitallers, the Templars, and then now the Teutonic Order. And one of the things that we need to talk about is that the Teutonic Order, as far as being, on that big stage, the world stage, so to speak, they were the latecomers. The Hospitallers had been around for about 120 years by the time that the Teutonic Order was founded. And the Templars had been around for 70 to 80 years, so to speak, depending on those dates exactly when you nail them down. But the early years of the Teutonic Order saw them, of course, in the Holy Land. That's the foundation for all of these great military orders. And it's in the case of the Teutonic Knights, the Teutonic Order, it was the Third Crusade. You had knights and rich merchants from the area of Lübeck and Bremen, that kind of eastern central region of Germany, who had drawn a big crowd and were in the Holy Land crusading. When Barbarossa's army had sort of just dissipated on his overland march toward Jerusalem, there was a good contingent that did continue on, and it was these guys. These guys from Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, some from modern day Czech Republic, Moravia, places like that. And apparently the Germans were not favored by the English and the French, particularly by the French. The French had problems with the Germans. They didn't like their language. They didn't like, a lot of what they stood for. And so you have this great military order in, the Templars that's primarily French. And you have the Hospitallers, which are primarily English, at least in later years, primarily English. They're a pretty big international group at this time already. But the Germans felt like they needed their own care. If they felt like they weren't getting good care for their knights and for their committed crusaders who had come all this way. They didn't take boats. They did the overland march all the way there. And so the Teutonic Order was originally a hospital organization, and it was only for German knights. I mean, they took care of other folks too, but it's primarily to serve those German knights who've been wounded. It was healthcare. So a field hospital, so to speak. And their charter was approved by Guy de Lusignan, who was king of Jerusalem at the time. Of course, we're talking Third Crusade, the Horns of Hattin, this whole kind of, difficult time in the Holy Land for the Crusaders. And you have the first three grandmasters. Some scholars will say that the lists that we have for those first three are accurate. Others will tell you that they're not to be trusted. And so the real history of the Teutonic Order starts about 30 years after their founding with their first big grandmaster, and his name is Herman Von Saltzo. And Herman Von Saltzo was an incredible character. He's one of the people that, as you read history, he's one that stands out as someone that you would want to know. This is somebody that had exceptional skill, particularly diplomatic skill, in his day and age. And if he was living with us now, he would be a top-notch diplomat, serving somewhere. So something that's very interesting about him is that he was from a ministerialis family. And I'm not sure how familiar we are in this group with terms, but his family was not a, kind of a pillar of nobility in Germany. The ministerialis were kind of this subclass of professional soldiers, particularly in the early 12th century, on into the 11th century as well, going back a little bit further. But they sort of rose to the military challenge, and they sort of just became nobles. you know, at risk of sounding a little bit ridiculous, they took their nobility at the tip of the sword, so to speak. And so that was still something in the early 13th century that was known. It was known that Herman von Saltzo did not come from a long lineage of great nobility, but that his family was an upstart. They were up and comers. And so that's something that was very interesting. He expands the order's prominence and resources greatly. Part of that is his actual skill. And another part of that is that he was a very close friend and the principal confidant for Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor at this time. And so he achieved a lot for the order in these days, even to the point that the Grand Masters of the order from his time going forward were considered of Prince Elector status in the Holy Roman Empire, meaning that they got a vote on who was going to be the emperor. They were supposed to be movers and shakers and powerful folks, and he had the ear of a powerful leader at the time. So in the early years, of course.
Ask a question?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Comment a little more on Frederick II.
Yes, please do.
And his significance. I mean, he deserves a whole lecture on his own, a tremendous character in history. So the fact that those two guys were confidants is really kind of puts them in it's like Beethoven and Goethe.
Yes, they're a different category there, so to speak. Thank you. There's in the early years, of course, in the Holy Land, there's not a ton of records that survived. And by early years, I mean about 1240 or so. There's scant records and evidence. Most of what we have of them from this time is archaeological evidence or evidence from other folks who were active in this area, in this region, and would mention them. And we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But one of the things that's important to remember is that they're looking to kind of get into new areas, not just in the Holy Land. So they move off into other areas in northeastern Europe pretty quickly after their founding. But their earliest time is here, and where they really sort of set their mettle, where everybody says, okay, these guys are for real, is at the Siege of Damieta. This is the Fifth Crusade. And they're in Egypt, and there are written records that survive from a lot of chroniclers and a lot of folks in this time. And the picture that you see here to the right is from Matthew Paris's illustrated chronicle of this time. And the Siege of Damieta was a long battle. A lot of intense things happened, but they were noted particularly for their valor and for their care of anyone who was wounded. One of the principal early nobles to really support them within the Holy Roman Empire outside of the emperor himself was Simon von Sarbroken, who was the Count of Sarbroken. And he was present at the Siege of Damieta, and he had a large retinue of troops with him. And there's different accounts that kind of determine what happened with his crew. But some folks will say that he was wounded and many of his men were wounded. The more reliable accounts say that they had a sort of illness or sickness. Jacques de Vitry, one of the chroniclers talking about Damieta, records that these men were suffering from what probably we would just call a dysentery. There was some sort of plague. We're very medieval even in our own times now. We have our own plague now, right, with COVID and everything. So we these men, we can experience to some degree a little bit of the mindset of what they were in. And so the Knights were very serious about taking care of their own, taking care of those who were wounded, and also in breaching the walls, in standing up to fight the troops that were within striking distance over the days of this siege. And so this was their big ticket. In the early days, this is what got them notoriety, good notoriety. They got some big donations, and they were ready to roll from that point. So from the Holy Land, they start to expand pretty early on. And one of the areas that they expand into is a place called the Burzenland. And this is a mountainous region in Romania that's pretty close to pretty close to some Turk lands at the time. And the Turks, even then, were having problems with a local population called the Cumans. And the Cumans were a force to be reckoned with. They were a warlike people, and they constantly were raiding, sending incursions into Christian territory in Romania, also into the Turkic lands around there. But particularly in the Christian lands, there's Andrew II, who is king of Hungary. And his land at this time is, partly what would be modern day Hungary, also part in what would be modern day Romania. And he's having problems. His nobles cannot contain these raids by the Cumans. And so he recalls the valor of the knights, the Teutonic Knights at the Siege of Damieta in 1204. And in 1211, 7 years later, he invites them in. And he says, I need someone whose sole job is to stop these incursions from the Cumans. So pretty early on, they get an assignment that is purely military. Their job is to be good at military matters. And from all accounts, they are. And they start something that's pretty interesting. They come in and they bring with them not just soldiers, but they're bringing settlers. They're bringing settlers in, and they are creating small pockets of German culture and community that actually still exist. There were villages that spoke German exclusively in this region until the end of World War II. That's how long this lasted. Okay, so they were of a different mindset than what a lot of the other military orders were at the time.
A quick question, if you don't mind.
Yes, please.
Everything that I've heard about the Germans in Transylvania is that they were Saxon. Are these also? Is it that jive what you're talking about? Okay.
Yes, they're from from Saxony, or the Saxony region of Germany, and so you're getting knights who are recruits from this area, and they are bringing with them other folks, other members from that region to sort of as a plant in this region. So,
Jonathan, can I have a question?
Yes.
I just wonder. I mean, Cumans are like a nomadic tribe of Turkic origin. How did the heavy cavalry could really protect against the light cavalry? Because they usually attack and leave. I mean, they don't engage in the direct confrontation with heavy cavalry. I mean, how successful were they in protecting people from Cumans?
They were quite successful. And the reason being that, just as you noted, the Cumans, and they were primarily a force of light cavalry and raids. That was their, that was their MO. They would go in, raid, and be out. And over time, they recognized as they're raiding, there's now a professional force of soldiers who are ready to meet them. It's not necessarily that they lose the element of surprise, but the scholars who you read on this will say that over time, the cost became too high for the Cuman raiders. It wasn't easy pickings anymore, and they were more willing to shift their attention and focus to something else that didn't have as much of a cost to their military force. Does that make sense?
Okay.
Does that answer that question? So this region of Hungary had some Saxon settlers already. This was kind of something that had started back in the 12th century, but the Teutonic Knights continued that. And one of the things that's interesting here, like you can see some of these pictures on the right. Here, the first town on top is Sigisura in Romania. In German, it would be Schlossburg. And the architecture is all exclusively German. If you go to any other town in this region, there's a Romanian flair and taste to those buildings and literally the layout of the town. Germans are famous now for their their precision, their engineering, their planning. The Teutonic Knights were literally building cities on a grid in 1211 here in Romania, Sigisura, and then also Roznov in modern day Romania. In German, it would be Rosenau. You can look these places up. Their fortresses, at least at Rosenau, the fortress still exists. It's still there. So pretty interesting. And one of the reasons that this doesn't ultimately work out for the Knights is because they build in stone. They had been told to build in wood, and they decided over a few years that this was not enough, and they were going to build in stone. And this made the local nobles very nervous. They saw their effectiveness against the Cumans, They saw their ability to field and resource the building of whole towns and market centers. And this was something that made those nobles quite nervous. And so they complained very loudly to Andrew II, and he ejected them from Hungary or from the Persian land at this time. And, you know, there's evidence of you know, Teutonic officials going to the Pope to try to maintain control of these lands, but ultimately none of those court cases stand, and they do leave peacefully. So that's kind of, you know, some early incursions. And also within 10 years or 15 years, we're in the Baltic. This is what this deserves the main focus of attention, and we'll hit this more in just a minute. But they're invited in by a Polish duke, Conrad of Masavia, in 1226, because the native Prussians at this time, they're still pagan. This is the last real pagan holdout in Europe. The native Prussians, the Lithuanians, other tribes, the Samlanders, the Samogitians, you know, lots of different local tribes, and they are ruthless. They're absolutely ruthless. They, you know, they have reputation for torture and for, you know, for just awful things. And they are also a raiding people. They are some of they are probably the biggest contributor to the Russian slave trade in the 13th century. Are these local Prussian tribes who would attack each other and sell each other off into slavery. They would attack the Christian regions of Poland and sell them off into slavery as well. So once we get into the Prussian theater, the goal is to curtail some of the violence that comes from these Prussian nobles. Also, the goal is to spread Christianity. And
question?
Yes.
Were the Prussians Germanic people? Were they speaking Germanic language? Were like related to the Goths, possibly?
From what I've read, they tend to be more Slavic than Germanic. But
I think they were Baltic
They
tribes.
were more connected to Lithuanians. That's what I read.
Yeah, but Lithuanians, like
Yes.
Baltic tribes, maybe a little bit of Slavic, but mostly Baltic.
Yes, modern day Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, they are of that people group, which is a subgroup of, you know, the kind of Slav umbrella. Now that doesn't mean that there weren't some Germanic influences or maybe some tribes that did have Germanic elements, but from the data that we have, from the accounts that we have, it looks more likely that they fall under the Slav umbrella than the Germanic umbrella, if that answers the question for you.
If I may add,
yes, please.
Their language was a Baltic language. It was not German at all. It's also Indo-European, but Baltic. And it's actually completely disappeared, but it existed in a very small places up until 17th century, but it's extinct, and they have been mostly speaking German after this invasion and repopulation of the area with German settlers.
Correct. Perfect. That's excellent. Thank you. Something that's very interesting about this is that missionaries go in first. With the Teutonic Order, at least in the 13th century. Things change a little bit once we get into the 14th century. But in the 13th century, what's written, it's always very interesting. You have to kind of parse out and read between the lines about what's written for official documentation versus what actually happened, on the ground. And from what we have in the written accounts, missionaries were always sent in first. So the first goal was to try to convert these tribes to Christianity. Now, part of the reason behind that, obviously there were religious motivations for that. Some of the other reasons that might be helpful would be that peace might be easier to achieve with Christians than with those tribes whose religious way of life was violence. Not that some Christians didn't have that. I mean, this is a very complicated topic. I'll be very careful how I approach it and how I speak about it, because we don't want to put things onto people that aren't correct. But missionaries did go in first, and they almost all died to the man. They knew that going in, it was a death sentence, but they went anyway. And this is something that's, to me, this is something that's personally very interesting. The mindset of these people who would go into Prussian villages and settlements. And what you're seeing here on the right is a recreation in Lithuania of a 13th century Prussian village. What a settlement like this might have looked like based on archaeological evidence, that's been uncovered in the region. And so these monks going in, members of the Teutonic Order, they weren't the fighting side. With any military order, you had those who served, those who prayed, and those who fought. Those were your three main categories. And these were those who prayed. And they went in to Christianize, to evangelize, to share the gospel with these pagan peoples at the time. And many of them were horrendously murdered. So at that point, with that failing, you begin to get into the Prussian Crusade, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. But first, we need to wrap up a little bit in the Holy Land, because the Holy Land was still the sort of sphere of influence for every military order until we get to 1291. Does anybody know what happens in 1291? It's a big thing.
One of the Crusades, right? Happened at that time.
Sort of. This is at 1291. This is kind of the end point.
Like a seventh Crusade, right?
Very close. Very close.
Or is that when Saladin conquers the Holy Land?
No. Saladin was like 100 years before.
It wasn't when Acre was.
Yes, Acre. The fall of Acre or Acre.
Oh yeah, that's right. So that's the last hold. Yeah,
exactly. That's the last foothold we have in the Holy Land. And they eventually, literally, they're surrounded. The sea is at their back, and this is at this point, at 1291, you have the three major orders: the Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, the Templars. Every one of them have their headquarters in Acre, because that's the only place that's left. That's it. That's the only Christian foothold left in the Holy Land. And so, up until then, there's pockets and regions around where we have, some Christian influence, where we have some military, economic influence going on for Christians in this area. And one of these areas is at Montfort, which is the French name of the Teutonic Knights headquarters. In German, it was Starkenburg. And they moved here in 1229. They started to build this castle. And believe it or not, it's funny, Starkenburg or Montfort is one of the finest examples of German castle architecture of the 13th century, and it's not in Germany. So that tells us that the Knights brought in engineers and builders, masons, carpenters from Germany to build this castle. They brought in folks who were expert in that arena. And so what's interesting here too, also the headquarters, it's kind of out in the boonies a little bit. It's out in the woods on the backside of the mountain, and it's removed. And what we don't know is if it was removed for a purpose, or if it was removed simply because that's where they got a donation of land. So what has been found here have been presses for shields. There's been molds for decorating shields, which of course is expressly forbidden in the Teutonic Order statutes. However, at least guys at the highest level were having some decorated shields. They found pieces of board games. They found other interesting things. There's been chess pieces found here. In two archaeological digs that took place in the 90s, which I think is very interesting. So they always had a headquarters and a presence in the Holy Land. It was at Montfort first. It moved to Acre in 1271 after this castle fell to Sultan Baybars.
Jonathan?
Yes.
Where is Montfort today? Is Syrian held land?
It would be Galilee. It would be in Israel. It would be in Galilee.
Okay.
Yes,
close to the Syrian border.
Yes, very close to the Syrian heights. Yeah. So
Jonathan, Baybars is a Mamluk, or no? Was
yes.
not Mamluk? Okay.
Yes. I'm sorry. He is Mamluk, and he was someone to be reckoned with by all accounts. And so in 1271, when their headquarters falls, they move to Acre or to Acre. And at that point, what's very interesting is for the two main orders that have been established here, the Hospitallers and the Templars, they still have their main forces located here. By this point, and it's still kind of hard to tell, but what many scholars will say is that you just kind of had a token force left for the Teutonic Knights in the Holy Land by the time we get to 1291. The headquarters is here because it's still much easier to recruit, folks for a crusade because they're still thinking Holy Land, but they're also recruiting folks for crusades in Prussia. And so you have this kind of split thing. Your headquarters is technically in the Holy Land, but most of your activity is not happening here. So as they get expelled All the Christians are expelled with the fall of Acre in 1291. This spells disaster pretty much for all of the military orders, but at a different level. It's absolutely disastrous for the Templars. They were kind of the chief military orders in this, chief of the military orders in the Holy Land. They were the ones who were the chief combatants in fighting, fighting Muslim incursion, fighting whatever they decided they wanted to fight. And when they had been excluded, there's a lot of talk that's going on, especially in France, about what are these guys even good for? We've lost the Holy Land entirely. The Hospitallers are struggling as well, but not as much as the Templars. And the Teutonic Order at this point doesn't even have much activity going on. So they are able to brush this off more easily than the other two military orders. So what happens? With the fall of Acre in 1291 and the expulsion of everybody out of the Holy Land, we have to move headquarters because we now don't have the opportunity to have a headquarters in the Holy Land anymore. There's no land that's left. So the first move is to Venice, and it's there until 1309. So for about the next 20 years, their headquarters is in Venice. That headquarters does not survive. So we don't have any idea to know where they were, what was actually going on there. But it seems like it was really only a stop because there were good relations with the Venetians, and Venice was a port, a great hub, obviously, an economic hub, a transportation hub. So it was a good spot to have a temporary headquarters while your main headquarters was being constructed. And the two pictures that you see on the right are of Marienburg, or in modern Polish, Malbork. So Malbork, this castle still exists. It's the largest castle complex in existence. It's the largest brick-made structure anywhere in the world. The first picture is from 1895. The second picture is from 2019. So you can see there were some changes that happened over that time period, mostly with smaller buildings and and bits and pieces that were probably necessary for it to function at the time. But now, as a World Heritage Site and museum, those buildings become less of a deal. But you see many of the major structures still survive. They're there. And the construction on that, particularly on the central keep, was started early on, even in the mid 13th century. But it was officially finished in a capacity enough in which to move the headquarters in 1309. So Venice is our temporary headquarters after Acre falls, and then we move on to Marienburg.
Jonathan, I have a question.
Yes, please.
So for Hospitallers, they had very unique churches. They were rounded churches. Was there any uniqueness to Teutonic churches?
I don't know that there's any necessarily specialized construction techniques. I know that in this region, particularly in Poland, and then in the Baltic, and also in Romania, it was not uncommon to build your church as a fortress rather than just a church, where you have high Gothic cathedrals happening at this time. These were fortress churches. These were the places where the villagers would retreat to in case of incursion, because especially in Prussia, on the Lithuanian border, in the Baltic, this was an everyday threat that you might have a raiding tribe come in and try to take out your town or your village. So if there's any kind of unique element or structural element to the churches at this time with the order, it's going to be a fortress church.
But it's not a Gothic style. I mean, this is a more kind of like a style they use there, maybe a little bit Roman kind of, yeah.
Wonderful.
Hey, Jonathan?
Yes.
Okay, so we're talking about early on. You talked about the ethnicity of these Germans, that they were from Lübeck and Bremen.
And Bremen, yes, sir.
And then later on in Transylvania, they're bringing Saxons in,
right.
And now they're in Hanover. Why are they in Hanover instead of Bremen, Lübeck, or Saxony?
By this time, are you talking about like mid 13th, late 13th century?
Well, they build this castle, right?
Sure. Yes.
So why in Hanover?
Well, at this point, they've grown to an international conglomerate, and they're pulling guys from all over Germany. And what they're doing is essentially what they're doing. We'll talk more about this in a minute. Is they're building the first modern nation state, period. And so they are very business minded. By the time we get to the 14th century, especially even by the early 14th century, they're very business minded. And so this becomes a hub, not just a headquarters for operations, but a hub. This is where you bring in foreign dignitaries. This is where you bring in men of means who you want to ally with or partner with, or you want to impress. And so it's not just about the basic, salt of the earth kind of people from Saxony anymore.
What was their source of wealth to build all of this stuff?
Sure, it depends. It really depends on what era we're talking about. In the early to mid 13th century, it's mostly donations. By the time we get to the late 13th century and on into the 14th century, it's taxes. And it's economic activity. We'll talk more about this in a minute, but they were major players in the Hanseatic League. And so they were very wealthy. Also, from the probably about 1275, third quarter of the 13th century, they were the exclusive controllers of the amber market anywhere in Europe.
It makes them sound more like a predecessor to a multinational corporation as opposed to a nation state.
Exactly. Now, the nation state piece comes in because they have self-governance, and that's very specific and unique for this time period. They answer only to the Pope. And the Grand Master himself is over the entire domain. He has nobody to answer to except the Pope. So to some degree, the nation state comes in from the governance side of things, but economically, they are a conglomeration. You're exactly right about that.
And how would that differ than from a free city like Bremen?
I don't know that there's a ton of difference. Bremen and Lubeck in particular are both trading cities. So that model was adapted by the Knights. Some of the towns that we get, like Thorn or Torin in modern Polish, and some of the other early towns are built or based off of Lubeck law. They're given that same set of law that reigns in Lubeck. And so it kind of gives us an idea that they're meant to be trading cities, or that the idea in their founding is we do need a military outpost here. We need a base. We need somewhere that we can hold on to and control territory from. But at the same time, we have a bigger vision for this. It's not just military that we've got in mind. So
aren't they also looking for expansion to the east, right?
Yes, they are. Absolutely.
The other part of it, and they basically getting into serious conflict. I'm sure.
And that continues right up to the early 15th century, where we kind of have a drastic turn for them. So now something that is important to recognize as we're kind of moving into our Baltic sphere is they absorbed two other smaller military orders. You had the Order of Dobrogin and you had the Livonian Brotherhood of the Sword. Both of these were much smaller orders. Dobrogin was centered in Poland. They only ever had about 40 knights. They had a disastrous defeat, and they were absorbed by the Teutonic Knights. So they get some fighting men, they get some land, they get some resources. The Livonian Brotherhood of the Sword was, of course, in Livonia. So that's like modern day Estonia, parts of northern Latvia. And they were allied. The Livonian Brotherhood of the Sword was allied with the papal outfit in that area. And they had a disastrous defeat in 1236 at the Battle of Saule against Prussian and Lithuanian tribes. And they were then absorbed by the Teutonic Order. They were also really not happy about this. There's an interesting story from the papal court in Rome where the leaders of the LBS were called and for an audience with the Pope himself. And they come in and they're explaining what happened. And after they finish explaining what happened, two men walk out and present them with Teutonic Order cloaks and drape them over the top. And it starts a fight in the papal court because they did not want to be absorbed. And so you have your main Teutonic base in Prussia, and then after that time, really the late 1230s, you have another arm in the northern region of the Baltic that is technically part of the Teutonic Order, but a lot of people, when you read the surviving accounts and when you read scholars on this, a lot of them will say that even though they technically were a part, they tended to be a little bit more willy-nilly, a little bit more free of the rules than what you would find in mainland Prussia.
But were they of German knights or the local knights?
They were German. Now there were some local knights, and we'll talk about
isolated that. Kind of looks like.
Yes.
If they're
yes, they are. They're very isolated. They're surrounded. So the only way really to get in is by way of Riga in Latvia, a major town. Even by the 13th century, there's the bishop for the whole seat of that kind of northern Baltic region. The papal seat is in Riga. The papal seat, the bishopric is in Riga for that area.
And also Tallinn must be also there.
Tallinn was there, yes, but it was much
called Revel, right?
Yes, Reval, yes. But they were much less of big players, at least in the region at that time, than what Riga would have been, as far as Christians are concerned. So really by the time that we get to the 1230s, the Teutonic Order is the dominant military and economic power in Prussia. And there's a whole crusade that's happening in the late 1220s and early 1230s. And we have to remember that in Europe at this time, these men were very religious and they were very concerned and worried about their eternity. And the Pope granted full crusade benefits to any who would go and fight in Prussia. And if you're a German noble, this is something that is very appealing to you. It's much closer to home than the Holy Land, drastically closer. It's easier to get there. And when I get there, there's a very organized outfit that is already there running operations on the ground. The Kingdom of Jerusalem was infamous for its infighting and, the different rivalries that you had going on in the king's court in Jerusalem. This wasn't the case in Prussia. You had the Grand Master. Well, at least at this time, the Grand Master was usually in the in the headquarters down in the Holy Land. But you had the Prussian master who was there, and it was his word. And so it was very efficient, and it was very, very unique as a military opportunity because you could get these full crusading benefits. And in a lot of ways, you're fighting an enemy that is not as well equipped as you are. That changes a little bit over time. But
another question.
Yes.
Weren't they at this point competing with the influence of Orthodox Christianity coming from the east into this area? Because they already converted back like Slavic tribes that converted.
Yes, that would come more to a head in the 1240s, particularly in 1242 at the Battle of Lake Peipus with Alexander Nevsky. But so that does happen, and there is some competition. But at this time, the Orthodox are not really reaching that far into Prussia. It's much more of the Teutonic Knights moving in from the west and kind of taking control there. So,
John, here I have a question. When you say full crusading benefits, I know they got remission of sins. What else did they get?
You get remission of sins. For some folks, depending on what your status was, your lord might offer you a levy of tax or a levy on taxes. So you might come in and you might not have to pay taxes for 1 to 3 years if you return home. You might also get paid to come and fight for your lord if you're someone of a lesser status. For your true noblemen, the biggest benefit was absolutely the remission of sins. And of course, as a theological conversation, whether or not that's something that's viable is a different conversation. But for these men at this time, for them to hear that is more than anything, because I won't say all. It's hard to say all, always and never. But many of these guys had blood on their hands. They were professional soldiers. That's what they did. And so the idea that they could be relieved.
Remission of sin, does that also cover things that they haven't done yet?
To be honest,
is it like granting them, license to do anything they want without any consequences to their immortal souls?
I don't think so. I'm not really prepared to speak to that element today. I've read some on it, not read enough to where I would feel comfortable saying a firm yes or no. I think anything that was regarded, I feel comfortable enough to say anything that was regarded to the campaign Yes. So killing pagans, you know, in the name of the crusade, while still it would be much more preferred for a missionary endeavor to, you know, to be done. When the missionary endeavor is not possible anymore, they want to stop the violence. They want to stop the, you know, they want to stop the incursions. They want to stop a lot of things. They also want to get remission of sins. And something that I think is that these questions are great because it's something that we really need to consider is that this is a complicated endeavor. You know, you don't have a lot of guys decked out in metal to just go out and fight because that's all they wanted to do. Maybe there were a few people who, you know, who were just difficult people and that's what they wanted to do. But for most people, this is a very complex issue. They do want remission of sins. They don't like that there are pagans that are killing their brothers. They don't like that these pagans that are killing their Christian brothers are doing so absolutely brutally, torture. To the medieval man, to hear of wrong and do nothing about it, if it was in your power, is a sin of omission. There are sins of commission, things that I do, that I commit, that I know are wrong. Sins of omission, where I should act and I have the ability and the power to act, and I don't. And so it's a very complex reasoning for this. But what we find is that there were enough nobles who were intrigued or motivated to go and fight in these Prussian crusades that they were very successful. So we have the early crusades in the late 20s and early 30s, and they're very successful. Here on the right, you can kind of see a modern day recreation of what your average Prussian force might look like there in the top picture. In the lower picture, we have the remaining frieze from a column in the Teutonic town of Kwidzyn. Or Kwidzyn, and it now exists on a fireplace inside Marienburg. But you can see the Teutonic Knights on the left with their swords and their axes, and then you see the Prussians on the right with their characteristic Prussian shields, and what they these kind of clubs, they're called Kolben, these kind of Prussian clubs, which are what we can kind of say would be the equivalent of a mace of some kind. Their equipment is very different, but they're a warlike people, and they had spent the previous 200 to 300 years just fighting each other all the time. And so after these initial campaigns are successful and the Teutonic Order is settling in and is establishing towns and establishing trade routes, every town is on a river, okay? No town or outpost is more than a day's ride from the nearest town. Everything is connected, and it is grid-based, and it is planned out, and it's this really big endeavor. It's this unique operation. But they weren't successful enough in eliminating the Prussian tribes or converting them entirely, that there wasn't still a threat. And so as early as the 1240s, you get the first Prussian insurrection. And this is actually led by a Polish duke. His name, depending on the source and who you're talking to, it's Świętopolk or Swantopolk. Chroniclers at the time used different spellings for his name, but he hates the Teutonic Knights. There are a lot of stories as to why, but mostly that he felt threatened by them in his territory, and he just didn't want to have anything to do with the Germans that were accompanying them. So he reaches out to some of these local tribes and incites violence in the 1240s. It's not just nothing. The Teutonic Order isn't able to just shrug it off, but they fight it off successfully. And then in the 1260s, you have the second Prussian insurrection. And this is where the razor thin margins occur on whether or not the Teutonic Order is actually going to survive. This is a major, major revolution of the remaining Prussian tribes, and also with a lot of support from neighboring Lithuania. And something that's important to remember, Lithuania now is one of the largest countries on the kind of European continent. And at this time, they were still huge, a huge people group. Very big, very military oriented, warlike people, but also very well connected. A lot of their grand dukes that we read about had connections with Russian dukes and nobles, and those in the east and the Orthodox territories, those things that were mentioned earlier. Lithuanians, particularly their grand dukes, can be some slippery characters. You can't really nail them down. And so that makes it tough. And so in 1260, you get Herkesmonte, who is this great Prussian leader. He's a noble leader. He had actually been captured in the first Prussian campaigns in like the 1220s and 1230s as a child and was sent for re-education to Germany. He was from a noble family, and so they had got him, and they shipped him off to Germany, and he was provided for, and he was educated, and he was taught German culture and German military matters and all of this great stuff. And then he left Germany and came back to Prussia and started a rebellion, a revolt, and it almost brought the Teutonic Order to its end. Brought them to their knees. The Battle of Derby in 1260, 1261 was a huge loss for them. And so then what we have is this large effort by German and particularly modern day like Czech nobles, so Bohemian territory. Ottokar II, who was probably one of the most powerful, he might be the most powerful character of the second half of the 13th century in Europe. And he decides that he's going to take the Teutonic Order under his wing, and he brings an army that is so large that there's report, and this is in the 1260s, there's report from a local Prussian at the time, there's a Teutonic sergeant who's talking to him, and he's a local Prussian, but he's allied with the Teutonic Order. He's a guide, he's a translator, and he sees King Ottokar II's army coming in, and he sees the first part of the army, and he says, "You might have success with an army of this size." And then he sees more coming in, and he says, it's pretty certain that you'll have success with an army of this size. And as they keep filing by, I mean, this is a march that takes days for this whole army to come through. And the sergeant looks at him and says, "What do you think?" And he says, "You can take the whole world with an army of this size." So whether or not that's to be believed is a bit of a different story. But the point being that Ottokar II showed up to play ball. He was ready to roll. And he came multiple times. And in many ways, he was very successful. We have, a German fortress town of Königsberg in what is really modern day Kaliningrad, the kind of Russian oblast region of modern geography. And this was built in his honor. Königsberg, the king's fortress, the king's town. He funded it. He brought all the construction crew to build it. He built it quickly. And then it was lost in the Second Prussian Insurrection and razed by the Prussians. And he came back and built it again and did exactly as he had the first time. Like it was nothing. His coffers were full of money. So he was able to do a lot of this. And so one interesting thing is that he would come for summer campaigns, but also by the time we get to the mid to late 13th century, winter campaigns become very popular because it's very cold in the Baltic regions in the winter, still is today. And you have rivers that freeze hard, solid ice. And these rivers then become highways where we can interface with tribes in ways that we normally can't. You don't campaign in spring and fall in the Baltic because it's swampy territory and it's rainy and it's not good for horses. A lot of the work in this region also is done on foot. There are still knights that are shock troops, and the Western Knights, the Teutonic Order, really does this as much as they can. But a lot of the work is done on foot because the territory in which that we're fighting isn't great for horses. So individual heroics become a big deal. One of my favorite stories is of a crossbowman named Heinrich Talpadel. And he's apparently a very talented crossbowman because during this Second Prussian Insurrection, he's at one of these forts and he's besieged. The Prussians have surrounded them and they're just going to wait him out. They're going to starve him out. And this is the first record that we have of the fact that the Prussians have been watching the Teutonic Order and have picked up some tricks. And they built a siege engine. They built some sort of catapult or trebuchet. And they had planned to batter the walls down and to make everybody inside go crazy with these projectiles that are flying over. And Heinrich Tappadel is out walking the walls. And one of the siege engineers is working on this catapult, this engine, and they're apparently within crossbow range. And so he takes a shot and drops the engineer, and he's dead right through the neck. It's over. And that sends a shockwave through the troops that are like, whoa, now things are serious. So the chief engineer for the Prussians takes over, and he's up giving directions and pointing out about things that need to be happening in order for them to fire another shot. And he raises his hand to gesture about something. And at that moment, Heinrich Tappadel releases another bolt and nails his hand to the siege engine. And at that point, the forces that are around look and say, this is not worth it. And they literally just melt away into the forest. They leave their siege engine, everything that they have, they just disappear. They've lost the will to fight, to hold on a siege, and it's over. And so Heinrich Tappadel, who, by the way, was a recruit from Germany, and he was a low-born man, is elevated and made a knight vassal in Prussia. And this is something else that's really important. You have the Teutonic Order recruiting settlers all the time to come in, because as we're taking over territory from the Prussians, we need folks to hold that territory. So they're bringing in settlers, they're founding new towns, they're bringing in new knights, they're bringing in new folks. And so what you need is the same system that we have in Europe at the time, particularly in Germany, where you have a knight of some sort or a noble of some kind who is vassalated to someone, or is vassaled, I don't know the correct term, in vassalage to someone that is more important than him. And rather than another lord, in this case, it's the Teutonic Order. And so he is seen as someone who is capable militarily. He can command troops. So he is given land. He is given settlers. A castle is built for him. And he then holds this territory in this region for the Teutonic Order. They make use of half-brothers a lot. And these are men who don't want to leave their life entirely and join the order. They don't want to give up all their finery. They don't want to take vows of chastity or poverty, all that stuff. But they can partner with them in some form or fashion. And in Prussia, this almost exclusively looks like vassals who fight for the order, more than just your 40 days of required feudal service. But they are at the order's beck and call. They are vassals to the order. And so they still live that life of nobility, but they are also serving a military order, which looks, in their belief at the time, it looks very good in the eyes of God. This is a sacrifice. This is something that I'm willing to do. So once the Prussian insurrections are finished, so to speak, and once they're kind of wrapped up, we start an expansion in the Prussian region, and it is military, but where it really shines is economics. A huge economic boost. What you see, the two pictures that you see here on the right kind of speak to that. The first is the inside of a wealthy merchant's house. You should expect to find multiple levels. You should expect to find rich painting. You should expect to find people in the cities who are now not just knights, but are towns founded on certain Germanic law, whether it's Lubeck law, or Bremen law or other types of law. They are primarily economic centers, and they do cooperate with the knights. Some towns are Teutonic Order strongholds or fortress towns that have large markets and economic centers built around them. Others are purely economic towns, but they are serviced and protected by by a local castle or a town close by that is a fortress town. So one of the things that's really interesting is that they just explode. Once you hit the early 14th century and the early 1300s, this region just economically explodes. The population explodes. A lot of people want to migrate to this area. Now, in the late 13th century, it's still very dangerous because the Prussian tribes are out doing their duty, to attack and to take prisoners and all that kind of stuff. So you're much more of a hardcore individual if you immigrate to Prussia in the 13th century. Once you hit the 14th century, though, it's much more safe, and you start to have new industries crop up. And also, the land is fairly fertile for crops. So the Germans are bringing in new technologies. They're bringing in windmills. They're bringing in technology, different tools, different farming implements. They're able to drain marshlands away and now use them as fields to sow crops. So that's something that's very interesting. And what brings a lot of people in is low taxes, low taxes. Also, your healthcare is provided by the Teutonic Order. It's still a hospital order, and there are hospitals in every town as you go throughout the region. And so also, if you are particularly connected, if you're a half brother of some sort or a major donor, you know, if you're not somebody that's super wealthy, you can expect a retirement or a pension from the order as you serve them in this way. So there's a lot of opportunity to not just be a farmer if that's not what you want, but to open a shop, to become a businessman of some kind or a business family. So they are a major trade network at this time. Some of the serious towns that are within order influence or direct control at this time, you'll kind of see here to the left: Riga, Reval, Danzig, modern day Gdansk is Danzig, Elbing, Thorn, or Torin. A lot of these towns are very big economically. So this is something that's pretty neat, and it draws a lot of folks, and they expand pretty rapidly. Something for the upper classes that becomes very interesting is this idea of Reisen. This is what the Teutonic Order calls their annual expeditions and incursions to fight the Lithuanians in the 14th century. This is exclusively 14th century. It doesn't happen in the 13th century. It happens pretty early on in the 14th century, lasts into the early 15th century. And so these are seasonal campaigns. They're against the Lithuanians. And essentially what you get is, in the early years, it's still mostly military based, but as you start to get to mid-century, it becomes this international affair. It becomes like it almost becomes like a conference where you go and you're expected to fight, but you get to meet lots of interesting and powerful people around the feast table every night. Okay, this is something that's very unique. This doesn't seem to really happen anywhere else in Europe that we are aware of anyway, with any regularity. The Grand Master invites important nobles, and it was a great honor to be invited to participate in one of these rising against the Lithuanians. Also, even though it became much more of a party than a pure military action, throughout the course of these events, they still bore papal blessing the same as a crusade would. So this is a perpetual crusade where you get to feast. It's a perpetual crusade where you get to build important relationships with allies, or find some new allies. One of the things that's very interesting, Henry Bolingbroke, the future Henry V, was a major player in Rising in the late 14th century. He went like 2 or 3 times and brought lots of folks. So this was a big honor. It's not just for show, even though show does become important. It becomes, you know, something with grand pomp and circumstance. It is still about gaining some ground militarily, letting Lithuania know we're still here. You can't, you can't just continue to exist without, in the way that you do, without acknowledging that we're here. But something that is interesting is it became a very big deal for big time nobles all across Europe. It almost became a rite of passage. And if you read Canterbury, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, you know the knight. The character of the knight is a knight who has gone and crusaded in Prussia many times. That's something that was well known to any big families in Europe at this time. So as Chaucer is writing this work, he's including this as something that everybody would have been eminently familiar with. Anybody who's anybody would have been very familiar with this. Some of the pictures that you see here on the right, the first is a recreated feast table within a fortress. So you don't see any paintings on the walls. You see some rough stone. So this is a bit of an outpost fortress, but still safe enough to host a grand feast. The second picture on the right is from Hessler's Apocalypse, which was commissioned for the order. It shows the infamous horns that often show up on these helmets. And while there's no hard evidence to show that crests were worn in battle, there's a lot of kind of subsidiary evidence which may indicate their use. And then the picture on the bottom is a recreation by an English, he's a Polish name, but he's an English archaeologist. His name is Alexander Plukowski. And Plukowski is one of the eminent Teutonic Order scholars in our time. And he took some modern day reenactors, something Sergio talked about earlier on, something he and I share in common, the great public education that can come from well-informed and educated reenactors. And they recreated a small excursion during the winter in northeastern Poland that would have been very similar to what might have happened on one of these rising. I'm trying to move quickly here because I don't want to take all our time, and I want to be sure we have time for questions. Once the Prussians were under control, the real enemy was Lithuania, and Lithuania would eventually be the undoing of the Teutonic Order. So seasonal campaigns became a big deal within the first quarter of the 14th century. By the time we reach early 1320s, they're pretty well established that we're going to have seasonal campaigns every year. There's going to be winter campaigns. They were a large enemy, like I talked about earlier. They were actually a very well-organized enemy. They were still tribal in many ways, which is surprising to a lot of folks, that the last pagan holdout in Europe, Lithuania, a still tribal people, could be as well organized and equipped as they were. But the fact remains nonetheless that they were a very formidable enemy. They stayed pagan officially until 1386, when Alexander Vytautas, in some of the German sources, he's Witold, he consolidated power and kind of became the first. He wasn't the first to hold the title of Grand Duke, but was the first Grand Duke who in some ways presided over a somewhat unified nation in Lithuania. And he eventually allied with Poland against the Order. The Order had grown so rich and so powerful that the Polish nobles, who years ago, a century or a century and a half before, had originally invited them in, could not compete with their wealth and their power anymore. So the Polish Grand Dukes and the Lithuanian Grand Dukes were able to ally against them. And the Order was very successful militarily. There's a 200-year-long struggle, and they were very successful most of the time, but they had never come up against an enemy that could absorb the kind of losses that Lithuania could and still bring men to fight. So that was something that would eventually...
Could I add something here?
Yes, please.
Well, as far as the Lithuanian history is concerned, like a little early on, at the end of the 13th century, the founder of capital of Lithuania, Vilnius, Gediminas, he actually conquered Kiev and the territory of Lithuania by this time, so you would understand, would be between Baltic and Black Sea. It's a huge territory that included contemporary Ukraine and Belarus, so a lot of resources. So it was very formidable enemy.
I don't know, Jonathan, if you've heard. I heard the Lithuanians quite a lot used the Mongols to fight the battles as well. Was there any collaboration you would know against Teutonic Knights?
Yes, of course.
Not a lot into the 14th century. In the 13th century, yes, the Battle of Liegnitz was a major blow to the Western powers. Mongols were in and around, and at that point, yes, I would say that there's good evidence to show that kind of collaboration between them at that point. In the 14th century, I think there's less evidence, especially as the Mongols sort of shrank from the explosion that they had in the 13th century. I can't say for sure that they weren't used or that that wasn't an element of Lithuanian, military engagements at the time. But also, I'm not very well read in that area, so I don't, I can't
could actually say that.
Yes, someone else might be able to. Yes.
Yeah, in the Battle of Grunwald, they did use some of the Mongolian troops, and also they used some of the what they call Ruthenian troops, which is Smolensk, which is in Belarus right now, and
apparently it's infantry in their case, I think.
Right, they actually collaborated with Mongolians against the Moscow uprising of the Moscow princedom in the Battle of Kulikovo. If you know, it happened in 1380, which is right about that time.
Yes, very
so the Lithuanians collaborated with Mongolians, but they came a little bit too late, and they didn't manage to help them. And that was the first battle that the Mongolians lost against Russians. Again, Muscovites, it didn't end up well for Muscovites eventually, anyway. But but that's the time. So there was some collaboration, not in a major. And yes, Golden Horde started to diminish at this time because, it was destroyed by Tamerlan already at that time. But they did bring some troops to this major battle. I'm sure you're going to talk about in Grunwald. And just to add one thing for you, Jonathan, specifically, about 20 years ago, I was in Poland and I was there at the reenactment of
Did you go to see the reenactment at Grunwald?
Yes. And I'm talking about there are like few hundred people participated. With
yes,
the
it's
horse,
huge.
with all weapons. And I was really amazed. And I actually visited Marienburg at the time as well.
Oh, wonderful.
Really,
it is my goal to be able to go to this one day. So it's wonderful to hear that someone has made
right.
I think I spotted Greg on that picture. One of the guys.
Let's move on to Grunwald. So you can kind of see the largest reenactment in Europe annually, just as we've been talking about, happens every year at Grunwald. Because this is the largest battle of the Middle Ages. I mean, period. It was huge. You can see the spectators, this first picture in the background, you can see the spectators. That it draws a large crowd. And it's very interesting because this battle was huge. It ranged over several acres of land outside the town of Grunwald. That's the Polish name, Grunwald. If you're talking about, in German, it would be Tannenberg. So a lot of times on my titles, you'll see that kind of, hashed line, and that's kind of the differentiation in terms, because if you want to go and research further, it's helpful to know some of the Polish terms as well. So
actually, when I was there 20 years ago, there weren't as many. There were a lot, but not as many as here. And I have to tell you, a lot of the guys who participated in reenactment, they got drunk. And they really started the real fight.
A real fight.
And there were a lot of people taken by the emergency, to the hospitals. I'm just like, oh my God, the blood.
So these spectators, you got more than you bargained for here. This
was pierogi and vodka, my friends.
I was just watching. I mean, and I was right. There was just right next to it, there was just like a police line. Not the people, just the rope. That's it around the field.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I love stories like this. They can kind of help bring this to life a little bit more for us, because it's particularly in the case of this battle, like it was a huge ordeal. If you look at scholarly accounts for this, modern scholarly accounts for this, the conservative estimate is somewhere around 67,000 soldiers on the field. Like, let's just conceive of that for a minute. Okay, that is a huge amount of troops. For those of us located here in the U.S., that's the average football stadium. What you can put. I mean, there are some stadiums that are larger, some that are smaller, but 67,000 is a lot of guys. And so you end up with about 40,000 Polish and Lithuanian allied troops, or the allied forces there, 27,000 troops for the order. And here's what's interesting. This is something that's really important to pay attention to. At this time, the order, by the time we get to this is 1410, by the way. So by the time we get to 1410, the order doesn't have many vassals anymore. The order is almost exclusively in power because of its economic prowess. They have enough money in their coffers to hire, like they call a few guys in, some Western knights come and join this great cause, but the overwhelming majority of these troops are mercenary troops and town militia. Town and well-trained town militia, not just some rabble that's out there. Well-trained men on horse, well-trained men on foot. And so they have enough money where they can say, yeah, we'll hire 20,000 mercenaries. And they also have, this is also something that's interesting to me, they have enough contacts to where they can find 20,000 mercenaries and field them quickly enough to come to the field of battle and present a real force. Now, they're still at a deficit compared to 40,000, but that's a significant effort to muster that kind of troop assembly. So it's a big deal. And the primary chronicler of this battle in period was named Jan Długosz. And he records that the din of battle, the noise of battle was so loud at this point that towns up to 10 miles away, or the modern equivalent of 10 miles away, could hear the battle. and they all wondered what's going on because they can see nothing on the horizon. So this is a big ordeal. The bottom picture here, if you'll see all these flags, this is from Jan Dugloš's account of the battle, and he was able to sketch the standards, the battle standards of every group that was present on the field. And these are the Teutonic Order battle flags. You'll see in the top left corner, you'll see the Grand Master's flag. This followed him wherever he was. And in the very top picture here, you'll see the Grand Master, his horse, barded in white with the gold and black cross and the imperial eagle, which, by the way, going back to Frederick II, that was when the imperial eagle was allowed to be identified with the Teutonic Order. That's how closely tied they were. So the Grand Master himself is on the field. You see the Order's flag in general, which is the black cross on the white field. And then you see different flags from different towns. You see different flags from different vassals and groups that had come to join in. And if you're interested, Jan Dugloš, his account is available online for free. You can just Google Jan Dugloš PDF and find his account. There's maybe it's the Torn Museum, I'm not sure. But one of them is put it online for posterity's sake, and it's awesome to look through. But what's very interesting too is that this was a tactically important battle. It was hard fought. Both sides really commanded very well, but it ultimately ended in the death of the Grand Master for the Teutonic Order. And this was the turning point for them. This was what would eventually spell disaster and kind of put them on the downward arc in their kind of history of development. And yes, go ahead.
What sort of tactical control did they actually have on the battlefield?
It depends on the era that we're talking about.
But let's take this right
sure,
now.
For this,
20,000 on one side, 40,000 on the other.
For this example, ultimately what you have is you're going to have smaller groups. So with a troop of 27,000, it's probably going to be more groups than just a left flank, a center force, and a right flank. You're going to have trumpet call. You're going to have flags. You're also going to have a meeting of the commanders of each group before the battle begins, and you set the stage and you set the order of what's to come, and you also do a little bit of what if this, then we respond XYZ. So you have yes, go ahead.
To give us some sense of perspective and comparison,
yes.
What would you say would be the average size in terms of number of troops for a battle, during this period of time? Again, to give us some sense of perspective in comparison.
That's hard to say. It's very different depending on where you are. The Italian hill towns that are, constantly warring with each other would have much smaller armies at this time because of the geography. At Agincourt, 5 years from now, when the French and the English, you're looking at about a third of this.
Maybe less. I think it was maybe 5,000-7,000 on one side.
5,000 to 7,000 English and about 12 to 15,000 French if you're conservative. So somewhere close to 25 to 30,000, which would be about a third of what we see here.
I mean, most of the battles in Europe, number one, at the field of engagement, you wouldn't have it didn't look like William Wallace, like everyone just chopping each other up.
No, very different.
Let's all go die today for maybe something. I mean, you would have a very, very strong initial strike, and if there was, it's almost like animals, right? I mean, you would get kind of one might be a little more dominant, and then they'd break off the engagement, or the other one would break off the engagement. So you'd probably had on average forces that were, except for the exceptions, right, the top 10 or 20 battles during the whole era, at least 10 times smaller than this, and in many cases probably more like 20 times. And you just wouldn't have a continuous set of engagements either. So this was gargantuan. I mean, this was like a Stalingrad or Leningrad for that whole era easily.
Right, it is huge, and it's hard for me I can't say with certainty. I'm sorry, I can't answer that question with certainty. I don't know. I'm not well read enough on all the battles to try to give an estimate, but I do know that from the French and English chroniclers about Agincourt, in 1415, that was considered a large battle. They thought that was big.
Yeah, one of the largest in Europe of that time. That's
What
probably the
percentage of
largest.
those armies were mounted troops, and what percentage were infantry?
Again, very different and hard to say. And so I don't know. From what I've read, I would say about 10% or less are mounted. But at this time, you also have missile troops in the form of not just the bow or the crossbow, but also you have guns on the battlefield.
I think Crusaders had more mounts. Crusaders
No.
had more mounts. They had more
Yes.
cavalry, heavy
The
cavalry.
Teutonic Order definitely had a
yeah.
good contingent of cavalry.
And I know that they famously attacked in a wedge formation, because that's what happened in Lake Preface. That was their famous. They actually called it like a pig formation, but it was wedge. That was their.
If I could intervene with a comment, perhaps, and Franja mentioned this in the chat. I mean, one of the interesting things is the question of motivation in terms of, the scale of the size of the battles, because many, as I understand it, many wars or fights during this period of time was really out of allegiance to a lord, right? So the number of troops that were, any one polity was able to muster was limited by the extension of personal loyalty. So it's not like today where
personal loyalty or wealth, if you were able to buy forces.
Go ahead.
I said, or wealth, if you were able to buy forces.
Right. Or the other thing, wealth. I mean, that's what Franja talked about, the mercenary forces. But again, the scale would not be that big. So again, this is why, the issue of, what is motivating this very large, massive force. I mean, that's, again, that's just what my mind turns to.
Yes.
As you're putting forward this excellent description.
And something that's very interesting, and I'm glad you brought that up, because in order to have the size of force that you have with Lithuania and Poland, you don't muster that kind of army without extremely significant effort. And so with effort being that intense, it tells you the level to which the Teutonic Order was dominant in the region, and to which they feared their growth, their continued growth, and their collective power. So, what was the actual, composition of the force? I'm not sure. I know that there are accounts at the time of the shock troop of the cavalry would try to break the infantry lines. We went through an infantry revolution in the early 14th century where the cavalry stopped just being able to ride them down. There you had very well-trained infantry troops who could take a knight who had spent his entire life fighting and training for this moment. They could pull him off the horse and have him dead in a matter of seconds. So there are accounts of that. There are accounts of infantry forces who would meet and battle and harass each other back and forth. And some sections of the line would fight while other sections of the line would rest. And they would both, take time apart to rest and reform and regroup and then go back at it. So I don't know. We don't know exactly what happened this day. But Jan Douglas does tell us some important information that the battle ended somewhat quickly. It seems that some of the larger infantry components of the Order's troops either were run down by Polish cavalry, or they were some of those mercenary forces that decided, hey, we didn't get paid up front, we're leaving. Many of them were paid up front. Some of them we don't know when they were paid. We have some account of others that were paid after. So it's very complex and complicated, and we don't know exactly what happened, but we know that it was a major struggle. It was a hard-fought battle. And ultimately, it's kind of this interesting point, because the biggest battle of the Middle Ages started about 100 years ago. It was this 100-year-long period of conflict between Lithuania and the Order, and it came to a head finally at Grunwald. It was a crushing defeat for the Order. They were able to retain much of their land and to some degree their diplomatic power, but they would never recover to their full former military strength. They just weren't able to do that. So,
Jonathan, may I add something?
Yes.
Quickly. First of all, during the battle, the Grand Master was killed, and that really destroyed the morale. That's maybe because it ended so fast, and it was root. They lost a lot of people. Well, as far as the leader of the Grand Duke Jagiello, the leader of Lithuanian forces, who married Queen Jadwiga, who was dead by that time, but that's how they united with Poland. But in the Central Park, by the way, there is a very big statue of Grand Duke Jagiello on the horse with
Yes,
two,
Jagiello, yes.
you know, yeah,
He was a
that's
forceful
so,
personality. He was a great commander.
right. So you could see it here it's near the castle, you know, in a Central
Yes.
Park in New York. You know, there is
Okay,
this
in New
very
York.
nice statue there.
Wonderful, thank you. Kind of moving on to their last years, there was a successful peace negotiated between the Order, Lithuania, and Poland. 1411 is called the Peace of Thorn, and it was a major achievement because the defeat was so great after Grunwald. But they were able to kind of recoup. You know, after that battle, there were attacks on Order towns and territory. The Order stood up at Marienburg and drove them out. So they were able to retain some of that power. However, they did become functionally bankrupt. I won't say functionally bankrupt. They still had money for day-to-day operations, but they couldn't continue on in the same fashion that they had before Grunwald after the Peace of Thorn, because they agreed to an 850 pound indemnity. So this is 850 pounds in 1411 money. Okay, that was 10 times the annual income of England at the time. That's a huge amount of money, and they had it in cash. They paid it, had it in cash. This was also after they had hired 20,000 mercenary troops, give or take, to fight at Grunwald. So this should tell you how rich they were, that they had that kind of money in cash. Not talking about assets in the form of castles or assets in the form of economic connections with the Hanseatic League, all of these elements of trade that they had in play in product or in or in stock of items. So they were rich. Okay, they were very, very wealthy. Also, internal conflict becomes pretty significant. This was something that does happen in organizations, even in our time. There's internal conflict, but it came to a head after this. Danzig and Thorn rebel against taxes that had been levied in order to try to recover some of the money from this loss. There's also an interesting group within the hierarchy of the Order called the Lizard League. That's literally what they call themselves. And they start to function openly within the ranks of the Order. Heinrich Von Plowen, who's the hero of Marienburg, is actually deposed by his peers in 1413 for no good reason, because Plowen was a great leader by many accounts, but the Order's hierarchy and structure was crumbling from within. So he was deposed as Grand Master in 1413. In the 1440s, we get the 13 Years' War between the Prussian Union, and it's against the Order's governance. Some unpaid mercenaries are going to revolt. Some were bribed by Danzig to actually revolt. So essentially, this is the equivalent to open civil war within the Order's territories. And eventually, we go another 100 years like this, okay? And in 1525, we have Prussia secularized. It's no longer the Teutonic Order's state, but now it's the state of Prussia. It's a Grand Dukedom, and the Grand Duke of Prussia has loyalties to someone else further up the chain. Livonia follows suit in 1561. However, even though the Order's state at the time called the Ordenstaat, even though that as kind of a nation state was now defunct, there was a religious element that survived constantly, continuously through into the present day, actually, which we'll talk about in just a second. But beginning in the 15th century, they were based at Mergentheim.
Yeah.
So, military history, very briefly. Strategically brilliant if we're talking big picture. 30,000-foot view, they were very successful. Here, the first picture, you can see the average equipment of a knight in the 13th century. He has, he has the enclosed helms, the great helm, the sugarloaf helm. He has a coat of plates, which is the first kind of plate body armor over his mail, and his accaton, which is a padded garment underneath the mail. And I'll talk more about this in just a minute. In the bottom picture, that's very similar. That's the average equipment of a knight in the 14th century, particularly in the mid-14th century. Over to the right, you can see an example of a vassal in the 13th century. Heinrich Tappadel, that I talked earlier, the crossbowman who was elevated to great status. This might be something that he would hope to achieve. And though it's kind of small in the background, his knightly manor or estate is there. Big picture, again, they are one of the wealthiest states in Europe, due in part to their military success. that was what laid the foundation. Afterwards, what really guaranteed their success was their economic and trade network. They were when it comes to business anyway, tactically, they were brilliant in establishing trade relationships and in being able to work financially. 13th century big picture is conquest and establishing military dominance in Prussia. It started in the Holy Land, but very quickly the focus shifted to Prussia, and that was a really unique thing. Also Livonia, so the Baltic states. When we get into the 14th century, big picture view is expanding the state that's been established in the 13th century and stabilizing the Ordensstaat, both functionally from a safety standpoint for immigrants, particularly in the early 14th century, and then further on economically. In the 15th century, we see the pinnacle of our power and the beginning of a slow decline. So what about their legacy? The military legacy, to me, is something that's also really important to talk about, because even though you have Prussia as an identity in later years, we often forget that it wasn't just German influence. It was specifically the influence of the Teutonic Order, a military order. So militarily speaking, the legacy beyond them is that in Prussia, you have one of the most successful military entities in history, right? With the Teutonic Order, starting in the 13th century, there's continual war for 200 years, sometimes larger scale battles, sometimes small skirmishes. They're able to recruit knights and regular soldiers, for lack of a better term, just common soldiers from all over Europe, particularly, of course, German. You did not have to be German to be accepted. You did have to speak German because that was the language that they spoke. But they recruited from all over Europe, and they also had order houses all over Europe. They had them on Cyprus. They had them in Italy. They had them in France. They had particularly a trading hub in London. There was a big connection between London and Cologne, and later on Thorn in the Order's territory is this unique trading entity. So they recruited from all over Europe. They were also able to grow and maintain significant territory in a tactically difficult environment, not just strategically difficult, but also tactically difficult. So moving on past them, we see Prussia as a region that retained a strong military history up into the 20th century. One of the things that I think is really, really kind of interesting to look at is that they were major players on the stage in every century militarily leading up to World War I. You have the 30 Years' War in the 17th century. You have Napoleonic Wars in Napoleonic conflicts even before that, in the late 1700s and into the early 1800s. 19th century saw wars against Denmark, France, and Austria. They were a military entity. They were a powerhouse. They were essentially what led the unification of the German peoples in the 19th century were Prussian leaders and this militaristic Prussian identity. They formed the core of the German army, the strong core of the German army from 1871 to 1918. And in particular, there are interesting accounts of British and American soldiers who would say, we like the Saxons, okay? They're fine. We like the Thuringians. They're fine. We hate fighting the Prussians. They're jerks. They'll kill anything that moves, and they will not surrender. They will fight and fight and fight until the end. So they had a particular disdain for Prussian troops, and I think that's an interesting legacy to see.
Jonathan, I just have a quick question.
Yes.
Question. Being that they had an influence on the modern military of Prussia and Germany, we know that they wore the Iron Cross as part of their insignia, at least in World War II.
They did.
Is there any ties to the Teutonic Order with that, or
yes and no? So particularly Hitler, in World War II, saw them as the pinnacle of pre-20th century German identity. Militarily strong, economically strong, organizationally very strong. And so that was kind of a lot of Teutonic imagery was co-opted to be this strong German identity. You even have some knives that were commonly in use with the Teutonic Order, particularly the Bauernwehr knife, some of the Holbein daggers that were popular in Germany, Switzerland, under Teutonic influence in the 14th, 15th centuries. The SS are issued daggers of these kinds. They're issued insignias that tie back to the Teutonic Order. So, the Teutonic Order and Nazis have ties? No, not really. But Hitler was very impressed with their history and used that as a way to try to present a strong unified force, particularly for his military endeavors in World War II.
Got it. Thank you.
Didn't
Yes,
Hitler
sir.
shut them down?
I'm sorry?
Didn't Hitler shut them down?
He
I mean,
did. He shut down the religious element
Oh.
because they were still staunchly Catholic, and they looked at him and said, we're not going to abide by your rules. So he shut them down. However, there are documents that survive that show that they continue to exist underground. They weren't kind of out in the open, but they did survive, and they have an unbroken legacy to the point that today, this very day, we could look and see that they survive as a Catholic charitable and hospital organization. That's what they do. In 1525, when Prussia, became a secular entity, there was a full split between the secular state and the Catholic organization, which was still focused on charity and hospital work. They were suppressed during World War II, just like you had said, but the line has essentially been unbroken since 1191. The current Hochmeister is Frank Beinard. So Hochmeister is the German for Grand Master. He is the 66th Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, in which currently the current surviving organization has 5 regions: Austria, South Tyrol, which is in Italy, Slovenia, Germany, and the Czech Republic, also some territory in Slovakia. They still own properties. They still run hospitals, entirely charitable hospitals funded by them. And apart from hospital and healthcare work, they partner with Catholic charitable interests in social welfare and education, particularly in Germany and the Czech Republic, but also in other places. And they also still, the half-brothers that I talked about earlier, that were kind of the military guys that held territory that had been conquered from the Prussians, they still exist, except now they're completely charitable. Something that they're lay members that continue to support the order's mission and work. They exist all across the world, and it's something that started in the 13th century. So I found that also very interesting. So when it comes to kind of talking about this stuff, I have some props to show us. Do we have enough time for a quick show of props? You can see some pictures here. The first picture is of myself and Sergio.
That's not me. That's my brother.
Sorry, that's his brother. We think that public education is something that's very important. And one of the ways that we achieve that is through reenactment, because at a reenactment, you are able to get up close and personal with things that are as historically authentic as we can reasonably produce. And you can see here, the reason I included this picture is you can see my uniform. This is, as someone that I portray, this is what I would wear when not in armor. I have a black tunic on. It's supposed to show humility. Also, coincidentally, black was a very difficult color to obtain during the Middle Ages. And so that also meant that there was some wealth involved. You can see my humble colors. It's black and it's tan. Gray, the gray cloak that I have, means I'm not a full member of the order. If I was, I would have a white cloak. But I have a gray cloak. That means I'm a half-brother. Okay, you can see that I bear the banner of the order on my spear, which means that, and the cloak in common mean that I am someone that is official in their terminology. As a half-brother or as a full-blown official, I might go and represent the order at with local tribes. I might go and conduct economic or judicial activities. So there's a wide range there. Underneath that first picture, you'll see that's not me. That's another reenactor. He's a German reenactor, and he's wearing some excellent chainmail. In the reenactor community, we call it just mail. And mail is something that is often misunderstood. It's not any necessarily less than what plate armor is, but at the time, technology didn't exist to make large elements of plate like you see later into the 14th and 15th centuries. So mail was the chief and primary form of protection. You can see how covered he is. And here I have an example of mail. I'll pull it back for a little bit. This is a mail mitt. You can see his hands. This is what he's wearing. I just have this independently here so that it's easy to hold and we can see. I'll try to get it up close to the camera so you can see the individual links, and you can see that there are some solid links and some riveted links. And these links these were the types of armor that would have been worn primarily in the 13th century. And then even as plate armor becomes more common in the 14th and 15th century, it doesn't replace mail. Mail is still worn under plate. Mail is also worn in areas that are difficult to put plate over, because mail is very flexible. Mail then provides excellent protection against cuts. So a dagger like this, for example, okay, this is called a quillen dagger. It was very popular in the 13th century. You have a pommel, just like a sword, a guard, just like a sword, and a blade. Okay, this mail provides excellent protection against cuts. Okay, however, I also have a very fine point. I hope we can see this. I have a very fine point on this dagger, and something that the dagger then becomes good at doing is piercing the links of the mail. Okay. Over on the right, you'll see a couple of extra pictures. You'll see a picture of a knight brother on the bottom right who's in full mail, just like we've talked about. And he's wearing a surcoat, which has the order's insignia on it. You can see the cross. Something that Sergio talked about earlier, surcoats became in fashion really in the 13th century, the early 13th century. And that became important because as helmets evolved to cover more of your face, it really became important for you to identify yourself on the battlefield with your troops. You wanted them to know who you were and where you were, not to mistake you for somebody else. And so the surcoat becomes very popular. And then you can see here, this knight would have been the average man that you would expect to find on the field with the great Prussian insurrections in the 1250s and 1260s. He would look just like that. The top right picture is a picture of what a camp might look like. I'm sorry, is there a question? Okay.
It's not a question. It was just muted.
Oh, okay,
when
sure.
The person came on, yeah.
Yeah, so you can see when on campaign, when you're out, you're not just out for the battle and you go home. Oftentimes you have to travel to where the battle is, or you might be on an extended campaign and you don't necessarily want to sleep out under the elements in the Prussian cold. So you have a camp that you retreat to. Different tents, different shapes, different sizes. I ran across a great account the other day of Edward the First in England at the end of the 1300s. Sorry, the end of the 13th century, the 1280s and 1290s, where he was ordering tents specifically that had porches on them. Now, something that he wanted. It was a way that he could get out of bad weather and still meet with his knights. Some other weapons that were very common in Prussia at the time. Remember the frieze that I told you about that showed the Prussian clubs called a Kolbein. This is a recreation. This is my recreation of what that might have looked like. A bludgeoning weapon is something that becomes really important as armor gets better, because a sword, for example, an oak shot type 12, like this sword, it becomes less able to hurt an opponent in mail and particularly in plate. I can stab in weak areas, but I can't cut through the mail. So bludgeoning weapons become more important because even if I can't cut through the mail, I can break the bones beneath. Okay, that's why padded garments, the accaton that I referenced earlier, or a gambeson, sometimes worn over mail, become more important as time goes along because I need something that can help absorb the concussive powers of certain weapons, like a club or an axe. Axes were very popular in Teutonic Prussia. Part of that is because in the local Prussian populations, the axe was a very common weapon. It was a favored weapon. Also, in accounts of the Teutonic armories in the 14th century, there's a lot of accounts of the armor and weapons that were kept at various fortresses and locations. Lots of axes, in Latin called the securis. Also maces and clubs. This Kolbein or this club is just a wooden, just a piece of wood, okay, that was turned on the lathe, and then it has iron tacks that have been nailed in to provide an extra point of percussive shock. And then here in the top, this is theorized, as nothing has necessarily been found of this, but it's theorized that there would have been lead or steel rod driven into the top to create a little bit more percussive force in the top portion. So those are some just some kind of elements that we have on hand. Something else really quick. I won't show you everything, but I talked earlier about how the Teutonic Order in the Baltic was known for amber, and you can't really. I hope we can see this. This is amber.
Maybe you should stop sharing so that there is.
Oh, maybe we should. This is a good idea.
Yeah.
Let's stop the share. I can see where to stop it. There we go. This is. Let's see if I can take a piece out where you can actually see it.
Now, while you're getting that out, the place of amber is the Kaliningrad. That's where they mostly get it from.
Yeah,
correct. That region, especially along the coast there. It almost looks like a kernel of corn. But this amber that I have right here is Baltic amber. It is still an amber producing center in the world today. So something that I just thought might be interesting to share. That's really all I have for you guys today. I really do appreciate your time.
Wow, amazing. This was really good. This is really good.
Thank you for your time
John.
and the option to speak with you. And
any other periods that you know?
Thanks to y'all today as well.
Any other periods that you know you may want to present? That you're welcome. This is crazy.
Middle Ages is my favorite. My two favorite would be the Teutonic Order, obviously 13th century. Early 13th century England is something I'm pretty interested in as well.
So maybe we don't do War of Roses. What do you think?
Possibly.
How did you get into the Teutonic Order? That's not like a big area of history that people talk about. I'm very curious as to why that.
My favorite. You know what? Can you give me just 1 second? I'm sorry. I've got some family here and I'm blocking them.
Yes, of course. Yeah, because that order is usually associated with Prussians or Germans, right? And the Templars is very well known, recognized by all types of people from mainly Europe, and I think France is probably the biggest.
Sergio, in Russia, that's all we knew. We didn't know French. Templars or Hospitallers. We knew.
Oh, is that yeah? You know what? It makes sense. Right.
Yeah. They call them. They actually had a name for them. They used to call them kriviches, which were anything that's of regions where the people that came from the Viking lands, and kriviches were actually the Teutonic Knights, and that's what Russians called them.
Really? I thought it was a Slavic tribe.
No, kriviches actually was the Teutonic Knights. Yeah, and that was interesting. There was actually one of the Novgorod's nobleman's daughter.
Yeah, lots of Novgorod.
Yeah. Married Teutonic Knights, and she was also connected to King Bela. So that's how. Yeah. So they
I got a stupid question, and you might have mentioned it, but I've been getting calls from my job all throughout. Does the Teutonic name come anything to do with Teutoburg Forest? Like, where is that name?
Basically, that's the Latin. That's a Latinized. Teuton is the Latinized version of German.
Yeah.
So anytime you hear Teuton, it's kind of this idea that it's German. So Teutoburg Forest, I mean, to answer
German forest.
Your question, yes, the German forest.
Right. That's why I had somehow a connection to that. Okay. Cool.
Well, there was a lot of connection to Arminius. I mean, the guy was, the Prussian guy was educated in Prussia, and then went back to fight against them. Isn't it an Arminius thing when he was educated?
Not
Prussia. That's the Romans.
Not Prussia. Prussia was not German.
No. Greg, stop the correction. No, I'm talking about there was an episode when he said that there was one of the noblemen, son from Prussia, was sent to Germany to study, and then he was sent back and he rebelled against Teutonic Knights. Yeah, Herbesnante. That's what I was mentioning.
Really?
Okay, because there's a similar story with the
that's Arminius. Yeah.
Right, the 18th, 19th, and 20th Legion or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
And the same story with Philip of Macedon.
What do you mean?
Philip of Macedon was a hostage in Thebes at the time when Thebes was of the military ascendancy over all of Greece and had conquered Sparta, and were the military innovators, and Philip basically that's where he got his start.
Yeah. Hostage was like a big thing in those days, right? It seemed like, hey, we can have peace between each other, but I need to have your oldest sons, and that's the only way it's gonna make it.
Yes.
He also was famously a Rata man of Pelopidas, who was like one of there were two leaders in the Thebes, Pelopidas and Epaminondas. And Philip was like came there. He was like 15, 16 years old. He became his lover of Philopatus. I mean, that's an interesting caveat of the history.
Now the question to you is, Jonathan. So all these people that were monk warriors, they weren't allowed. They were, obviously, executing celibacy, so to speak. What was happening with their life? So it's not exhibited, or nobody talks about it, or they kind of sneakily was doing all that stuff. I mean, how did they reproduce? How was the Teutonic Knights reproduce and stuff?
I mean, some of them, how do they reproduce? Yeah, sure. Some of them were obviously having stuff going on with local women, because there are tons of accounts where, like, the Hochmeisters or the Grandmasters over and over and over again are like, hey, remember, you're not supposed to have personal possessions. Hey, remember, don't decorate your shields. There's a great article by a Latvian scholar via America. His name is Indricus Stearns, who talks about, the article he wrote was called Crimes and Punishment of the Teutonic Knights, primarily in the 14th century. And so there was some of that going on. But how did they reproduce? They were recruiting people all the time. So in the 13th century, the main way that they recruit folks is they recruit temporary crusaders for big battles. And then they have a smaller organization that holds that territory. And they do it with vassals. They do it with half-brothers who will come in and partner as partners. So like they'll pick somebody out from the Holy Roman Empire and say, we'll give you land and money and no taxes over here if you will come and hold this section of territory for us. Also, there are a lot of nobles in Europe that have second, third, and fourth sons who will get no inheritance at all. And so they would join the order as a full brother. Those are the ones who join and live in the order monasteries and houses, either on the clerical side as priests or those who prayed, or on the fighting side. They had all been trained since birth to fight. That's what they spent their time doing. And so you have a readily available group of soldiers that you can recruit who are well trained, and most of them will survive. You have some tragic situations, but many of them are hardened combatants that know their way around every weapon you can imagine and have good awareness. And so a second or third son who has no hope of inheritance can receive great honor for himself and his family by technically renouncing any titles or things he might have from his family, which in reality he's not getting much anyway. And he'll go and join the order. And that becomes, he then becomes posted to Prussia, or posted in the early days to the Holy Land. And he fights for the honor of God. He fights the pagans. So we have to, something that's really important to remember is we can't fully put ourselves in that place psychologically, what motivated these men. But many of them were really motivated to do this. So, how many of them were strictly following the rule? I don't know. It's hard to say. There's evidence to show that a lot of them really did, but then there's also evidence to show that some of them didn't. So.
Yeah, it's hard to say. It's really hard to say. I mean, you could go back into the Roman era where legionnaires weren't allowed to marry or have kids and stuff like that. And we know there's evidence that they did. They did mate with the locals and stuff like that, and most likely that their offspring would have joined, the legionnaires, especially in Britannia. There is evidence of that. So yeah, it's really hard to say. Right. Yeah, it was an established law and it was an enforced law. Very, very unlikely, especially when there's land and there's money involved and stuff like that. Right.
But I think in medieval time, tradition was that the second time goes to church and the third son goes to army. I mean, there was, and all the fourth and fifth also goes there. They have no place to go.
Right. You might be able to make your way if you could, the tradition of the knight errant, the knight with no seat. He has no castle. He has no manor. Right. But he goes and makes his way in the world at the tournament.
Mercenary.
William Marshall is everybody's heard of William Marshall. He's the pinnacle example of this ideology, where he was so, he had such skill at arms that he could go and fight in tournaments and make all kinds of money, eventually to the point where he himself was considered a noble because he earned enough money at, fighting. So.
Yeah. I have two quick questions. First question is, so when they were building the hospitals in Jerusalem, and obviously it's financed by Lubeck and the Bremen
traders.
Traders, yeah. So was this a German identity they're trying to present and saying, well, we'll just have, you guys have hospitaliers and whatever, and we want our own, as to kind of identify that Germanic identity, so to speak.
And now, I haven't read everything out there, but from what I've read, the trend among modern scholars, at least, seems to be that they didn't have another choice. None of the other hospitals or orders would take the Germans. People just didn't like them. Primarily the French didn't like them. So if they wanted decent care at all, they would have to provide it themselves. So, so to some degree, the initial funding and doing this was simply because we didn't have any other choice.
I see. And the second question, what was the age of entry? I heard it was 14 years old.
I think it depends. I think it depends at different. That's my answer to everything. Well, we don't really know, but the earliest record that I found, there was a certain widow in the German town of Mainz who became ward over her nephew, and she, from the way that the account reads, it seems like the nephew is just before his coming of age, which probably is like preteen, early teen years. And she pays a sum to the order to guarantee that upon his coming of age, they will accept him as a half brother in that region and in that area. And so to some degree, he would be taken care of by them if something was to happen to her before he reached that age of majority. So based on other stuff that exists and that's by the way in the late 13th century. So based on the evidence that we have from other cultural norms at the time, you're probably talking mid-teens before somebody is really considered of age. That probably varies based on time and place and need, quite honestly. If you're in great need, you might put some younger guys up on the front, but
yeah, if I had to guess, I probably would be the same age as a squire. If these are people that again were going to be trained and they were invested in, and they were going to be knights. So you're not going to get a 9-year-old, or you're not going to get a 30-year-old. So yeah, I think that makes sense. A 14-year-old, 15-year-old from somebody with a noble backing would probably make sense.
Hey, Jonathan, have you, since you're interested in medieval time, have you read the trilogy about the War of Roses by Con Eagledon?
I have not. No.
Have you heard of it? Fantastic.
Which one was it called?
Thank you. I will put that on my Amazon cart this evening.
Con Eagledon wrote like the whole trilogy. It really made like so clear to me what happened there, because it's a confusing time.
Wonderful. Thank you for that recommendation.
And you can't even, it's a page turner.
That's what I need right now. I could use it.
Okay, cool. So
hey Zach.
Yes.
I have a quick question, and Jonathan. So I know I want to say it was January I'm supposed to do the Hanseatic League, and I'm wondering if Jonathan's around, because I've prepared a ton of stuff, but I mean, just his era background's awesome, and just the scale of the coverage, it's another sort of Pacific War monster when you get into it. It's like 700 years.
It's quite the legacy on its own.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know if that's something you'd be interested in, Jonathan, and you'd be okay with that, Zach.
Yeah, I'm good. I can, I could definitely send out the dates.
I definitely have some resources I can share with you. Would be happy to chat with you about it. Again, I'm not an expert in anything.
Oh, we're not an expert in anything either.
No, Jonathan, you are an expert in Teutonic Knights. Okay, anybody here in this chat disagrees, please speak now. You are a freaking expert, my man. You know your stuff.
Talking about an expert, look behind you, my friend. How many casts? I mean, what do you have behind you? It has like knight stuff behind you. Look at this. Turn around.
Behind me here?
No, behind Sergio.
No, Sergio. Yes. He's got some equipment.
I'm sorry. My apartment's a mess. I apologize. Yeah,
no, but look, no. You have knight stuff behind you on the windows.
I have a stupid 13th century flat helmet. And to the left, I have a cabasset, which is a Spanish or Italian 16th century helmet with the bever, which I'll discuss when I discuss the Americas and the whole rise and fall of the Aztecs. But no,
Crusader helm there is first quarter of the 13th century, so 1200 to 1225. And looking at it, it particularly has a German flair to it, with the short back end and then a long faceplate up front. So
Cult of Athena, baby, Cult of Athena, bro.
Another one.
$175 from about.
By the way, this Battle of Prepes with Alexander Nevsky is a big thing in Russian history. And, you know, they made like movie, and, you know, Sergei Prokofiev wrote an opera about it, which is fantastic.
Now, believe it or not, my undergraduate degree is music. I studied opera. And so Prokofiev,
So, yeah.
Prokofiev
No way. So you're a tenor?
No, I'm actually a baritone. So,
oh, all right.
But
and have you seen the movie? Because they
and that's
because they play the opera there.
Well,
great.
You know, you know, Nevsky is the Russian hero, and particularly in that time period, you know, against the Germans, it was very fresh all again. And Sergei Eisenstein, who made the film, he was from Kaliningrad. So he was from the region where the Teutonic influence was the greatest in that kind of Russia Oblast region now. And so I kind of have this theory that he was intimately familiar with the order just from growing up in that area. He saw the architecture that survived.
Exactly.
You know, he would have known all of this. So, you know, some of the stuff that especially some of the.
And that was before the World War II, right?
Yeah, that was in 1920.
Yes, before it was destroyed. Yeah. Or was bombed and
no, it's great. I mean, he's one of my favorite directors. He's amazing.
He definitely knew what he was about and what he was doing.
I've seen it since childhood many times since I was a kid. It was a big thing, you know.
Yeah, it was not built as a tale, right? It was actually built as the movie in Russia.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, and Alexander Nevsky is, you know the reason he called Nevsky is because 2 years prior to that, he had a battle with the Swedes who tried to invade the territory.
Why they tried to invest? It also was Pope that sanctioned it against the Russia, and the Swedes were the only ones that called up to it.
Right. But he defeated them, and that's since then he got this nickname Nevsky because it was on the river Neva. You know, that's how it was called. And in that year, when there was a battle with Teutonic Knights, believe it or not, there was also a failed Mongolian invasion into the Novgorod, but they didn't make it for the same reason. They started too late, and they got stuck in the swamps around it, so they didn't make it. Otherwise, it would
there, and the Russian winter is something to contend with.
Yeah, but because it was in the spring, a bit too late, they started to thaw a little faster, and they on the horses. I'm talking about Mongolians, and there are swamps around the Novgorod. So because it's already got a little bit warmer, they got stuck in there. They couldn't move on. But otherwise, it would be attacked on all sides. You know?
All right, guys.
Yeah. Speaking of books, really quick. Anybody familiar with Osprey Publishing? It's I know you're familiar with it. It's they make a lot of books about specific areas in history, everything from ancient Greece to even World War II and even so on. You know, it's really, they have great
they're a good intro for sure.
Yeah, exactly. Good intro of what's going on, the specific details, pictures, archaeological stuff like that. So I recommend checking out Osprey Public. I know Joseph Joyce, he knows about those books, and he's one of them about the Teutonic Knights.
Oh, yes.
I know you know this book.
Yes, I do. I've got it on my shelf.
Check it out. They have everything from gladiators to Spartans to Teutonic Knights to Templars to battle action court. Yeah. So I really enjoy those books, and that's that. But anyway, listen, again, thank you so much, Jonathan, for doing us an amazing favor of covering this fantastic topic.
Thank you all for this opportunity.
Exceeded.
Really like
Jonathan, great job.
Really like to hear from you again. That was really
yes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, definitely.
More roses, guys. More roses. We can do War of Roses next, or we will put it in somewhere in the schedule.
Yeah.
Good night,
Sure.
everybody.
All right. Good
my
night,
friends.
everybody. Take
Good
care.
night.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan. I appreciate
Thank
it.
you, guys.
Great job. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.